first off, thank you for being with us today, Steve. We appreciate it very, very much. So first question. Being from New York, specifically Queens, in the time that you were born, New York had such a strong comedy scene going on there. Are there any comedians from that area that specifically gave you the drive to want to become a comedian?
One of my favorites of all time is from New York, George Carlin. Grew up actually a few blocks from where I went to college, Morningside Heights. And he has a great bit about Morningside Heights that I really enjoyed, especially while living there. But the other comics that I grew up enjoying are from all over the place. I mean, Bill Hicks, born in Valdosta, Georgia, made a name for himself in Houston. Dick Gregory, I believe, was from St. Louis originally. And, you know, New York has had a great comedy scene, but a lot of the greats from New York weren't actually from there.
Now, I found you, and I know a lot of people have found you, your fame coming from you embracing YouTube videos and from confronting hecklers.
Yeah.
Now, how did you develop a quick enough wit to deal with them? And do you have any memorable heckles that are always right there that you'll never forget, the people?
Telling you the story of the memorable hecklers would take this entire documentary, but the skill to deal with hecklers came from a combination of being the youngest of four in a family where banter was our love language. But also, I was bullied a lot as a kid, and I had to think quickly. It was a survival skill. Wit is a combination of nurture and nature. You have to be born with a certain capacity for it, but practice makes you better at it. And so, I guess the more I was pushed, the more I learned to defend myself. There's a story I tell in one of my books about the first heckler I really had to deal with, the first time I understood the psychology of it. Because dealing with a heckler is, you know, it's from Gladiator, you win the crowd, you win the day. The audience needs to hate the heckler more than you do. And I was playing a club outside of Detroit, doesn't even exist anymore. It was called Joey's in Livonia, Michigan. And I was featuring, and I was having a great set. It was going really well. And I got into a bit that wasn't partisan at all. It was about spending so much money on politics, not partisan in the least. And this one woman yelled out, I thought this was going to be a comedy show, not a political rally. And I said, well, you can tell it's a comedy show by all the people laughing. And I thought that would be enough. But then another guy yells out and goes, well, you're not doing very well. Now, I'm faced with the problem of I just used the, hey, look, I am doing well comeback, so I can't use it twice. And so I start to try to get information from him, find something I can use, get him talking, and he's not talking. I ask him what his name is, what he does for a living. He's not answering anything. He's just stonewalling me. And at a certain point, I finally get him to say he's retired. And so I say, are you retired from being a heckler? Very weak comeback. I was hoping it would go somewhere. And he got kind of offended by that. And he said he wasn't heckling, and he said that I was being mean. And I, not in an effort to get the crowd at all, I just genuinely laughed. And I said, well, here's how this works. I'm going to say a bunch of things tonight. You're not going to enjoy all of them, and I'm not going to give a fuck. And the crowd lost their mind in a way I had never seen before. I looked back at the tape afterward, and they were applauding for 16 seconds. Halfway through, I tried to get their attention again. I tried to be like, all right, thank you, we'll get back to the show. And they kept going. And I thought about it afterward, and it was the first time I had like a really long line after the show of people trying to meet me, take pictures, etc. And I thought about it because I was like, why? Why did they go so crazy for that? And then I realized, oh, I was having a good show. They were having a good time. And then this idiot tried to make it about him. They were so mad at him that anything I said to the guy, they would have been okay with. And I learned a ton from that experience.
So comedy has always been known as a place for broad ideas, specifically through the 70s and 80s, with comedians pushing the limits, like Andrew Dice Clay, Richard Pryor, George Carlin. Now, do you think that type of comedy that pushes limits that way has a place in today's society, along the lines of like Greg Giraldo, Anthony Jeselnik type stuff? Purposely offensive, I guess?
I kind of reject that question because pushing limits and being purposely offensive are two different things.
Okay.
Pushing the envelope is one thing, tearing it up is another. And pushing the envelope means expanding borders, expanding reach. I think there's tons of room for that. Giraldo is great at it. Jeselnik is great at it. I think there's tons of room for that. Jeselnik had a wonderful take where he said that comedy is getting away with it. It's, yeah, you can say something awful if you say it in a way, or you say something that you're able to get away with. When you say something awful and people hate you for it, that's not comedy. That's just saying something awful. I would definitely not put Dice Clay into that because Dice Clay wasn't pushing any boundaries. He was just saying things that offended a large swath of people. Now, as an 8-year-old, I thought he was hilarious, but I was a child. There is so much room for pushing boundaries, but pushing today's boundaries is not the same as pushing boundaries from 30 years ago. The boundaries are different. The goalposts have moved. The construction of society is completely different than it was. And the people who are so worried about like, I'm gonna get canceled, and they take, it's so stupid. It is so stupid because society evolves, we have to also. And what was progressive in 1983 is not progressive now. And just because you were progressive in the 80s doesn't mean you're progressive now unless you paid attention, learned, and changed with society. I love comedy that pushes boundaries, but I can't think of the comedian who said it. I think it was either Ryan Niemiller or John Conroy. But after the Boston bombing, there were 1,000 comics who rushed to Twitter and real lazy jokes, terribly lazy jokes. And I forget which one of them said, because they both had really great poignant takes on it, but one of them said that a joke has to be 51% funny or more. If it's a joke about race that's only 40% funny, that's just a racist thought. If it's a joke about race that is 70% funny, then that is a joke about race. And that's what makes it stand out.
As a Nobel Peace Prize nominee,
Yeah.
okay, obviously we're going to talk about this, with your work in the comedy community, the way that the world is so divided today, do you think comedy can help bring people back together? And if so, like how?
I don't think people need to be brought back together. I think there needs to be a culling of opinion. I think that the idea that someone needs to reach out to a bigot to find a way to understand them. No, sometimes people are just wrong. And I did a bit on it about the idea of like there are two sides to every story. No, there aren't. Some stories are pretty one-sided. If someone burned down your house, would you want to reason? Would you want to understand why they burnt down your house? Or would you just go, hey, that was wrong? There are certain things as a society that we should agree that are wrong. And when you look at school shootings, for instance, the idea that someone can go, gun control isn't the solution because, okay, I don't agree with it, but I can at least respect their idea for another solution. But the people who act like it's not a problem, they are simply wrong. Kids getting murdered in school is wrong. There is no two sides to that. I think that comedy can help bridge the gap between the people who are on the fence or slightly on the other side of the fence. But I don't think we need to reach out to the people who hate. I don't think we need to compromise. There's a thing called the tolerance paradox, which is tolerance of intolerance is not tolerance. And so when people will make that, oh, the tolerant left, because you're not reaching out to the KKK or you're not reaching out to the Proud Boys or whatever it is, who cares about them? I don't care. They gave up on their humanity themselves. If they want to reach back out, fine. But I don't need to find a way to communicate with a neo-Nazi.
So over the course of your career, you've had the opportunity to take on many different roles and different jobs. Like you've been a panelist on baseball shows, you've been an executive producer for Fox, you own the comedy project in Pittsburgh.
Steel City Arts Foundation.
Steel City Arts Foundation. With all the different things that you've done and that you do partake in, if comedy ever became no longer an option for you, what would your focus be and what would you pursue?
If I couldn't perform anymore, I think I'd pursue the business side of it. One of the things that appeals to me about the business side of comedy is it is creative, it's just a different kind of creative. A lot of people will say, oh, it's rare that someone, is in the arts and also has a business mind. And I'm always like, why? Because if you're good at business, it's because you're creative. And I don't mean if you're good at business in that, like, you work at tricking old people into giving up their pensions. I mean genuinely good at business. And I think that you can do both. It's weird to me that comedians strive to be original on stage, but off stage, so many of us are a bunch of hacks. Off stage, so many comedians are like, oh, I see that promo worked for that comedian, so I'm gonna do exactly what they did. But on stage, you'd be mortified to do that. So why not try to be just as creative off-platform?
Okay, because you're in Canada, I have to ask you.
Sure.
This is something I did not know about you until I looked, and I thought I was on top of things.
Okay.
On top of being a comedian, you're also an author. You've written columns for your previous universities, as well as 2 books. But when I looked, I noticed that you have a credit for being a writer for the NHL.
Yes.
Being Canadian, that's our religion around here. What exactly did you do and what was your role?
I was what was called a celebrity blogger, and I put that in quotes because I was one, for the NHL. Each team had one. I'm a big Rangers fan, and so I got to write about the Rangers. And it was, during that season, Alicia Cuthbert was the blogger for the Kings. And so I just made my blog a running joke about trying to get Alicia Cuthbert's attention. It was very silly, very ridiculous. I didn't grow up a hockey fan. I came into it when I was 13. My best friend at the time was a huge Rangers fan. And so I started watching games with him and I started getting into it. And I got a little lucky in that I started watching the Rangers when they got good again. This was 1992. So when all the other Ranger fans were like, we waited 54 years for the Stanley Cup, I was like, I waited 3. It was fine. I felt like it was going to happen all the time, and it hasn't happened since. But I like hockey a lot. I don't know it as well as I know baseball. But this year I had so much fun watching the Rangers in the playoffs, and my wife is a hockey fan. She's a Blue Jackets fan, so she has plenty of room to watch the playoffs. So she's been super supportive and has kind of gotten to the Rangers with me. The Blue Jackets are still her team. She's from Columbus. But we had a lot of fun. We watched every game of the playoffs, and even though they didn't make it, it was still really exciting to watch. And hockey there's nothing like watching it in person. I love going to a baseball game, but I can enjoy it on TV just as much. Hockey in person is so different than hockey on TV. And so going to a hockey game is just one of my favorite things. Oh, and one of my career highlights was MSG put me up on the scoreboard, like as a look who's at the game kind of thing. And so I have this picture of me in a Rangers jersey excitedly on the scoreboard, and it says Steve Hofstetter, and that was that was a delight. And then I went another time. They put me on twice, and the second time they put me on, they were playing Anaheim, and the video guys at MSG dug up a bit I had making fun of the city of Anaheim, and they played it in the Garden during a game, which was just, oh, what a dream come true for a sports fan. That was the best.
again, as someone who's worked in both sides of the industry, what advice could you give a young comedian that's just starting out today, but wants to try and make this their passion and their full-time endeavor?
Sure. Comedy today is about building your own fan base. The gatekeepers are gone. We have direct access to audience for the first time in history. And that's incredible, but you cannot sell a product that doesn't exist. And so there are some comedians who are concentrating so much on building a following, they're not building their act. And you have to do both. An act without a following doesn't sell any tickets. A following without an act sells tickets once. So you need a combination of them. If you're just starting out, the two pieces of advice I like to give is, one, there's no substitute for stage time. You have to get up there, and it doesn't even have to be in person anymore. You can do a Zoom open mic. You can do a writer's group. There are so many ways to hone jokes that aren't just a bad open mic with no one listening. But there's this ethos among young comics of, oh yeah, I got up 4 times today. Well, great. When did you have time to write a joke? When did you have time to live a life that is worth writing jokes about? Experience, getting up 30 times in a week is diminishing returns. At a certain point, you gotta get dinner with some friends. You gotta go to the beach. There are things you need to do in order to write jokes that are relatable to other people that aren't just comedians. Oh, and keep people in your circle who are honest. The reason that there are so many comedians who are not as good once they get really famous is because there are a lot of comedians who don't keep honest people in their circle. They're surrounded by yes men, and you've got to know what's genuinely funny and what's only funny to the people who are sycophants. So it's one of the reasons why Chris Rock is still so good, because he will go and bomb purposefully for 10 minutes in order to get the crowd to stop caring who he is, and then he goes into the stuff that he's actually working on. And there are some comedians, I don't want to call anyone out by name, but there are some comedians who have just built this group of people who kiss their ass, and they'll never learn what's actually funny from their new set, because what's funny to you isn't necessarily relatable to someone else. And so no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how good of a comedian you are, you need to know how to relate to your audience.
One of the things that you've been able to do with your career is you got to be a guest on the Joe Rogan podcast.
I was.
Now, there is a group of people that like to call the Joe Rogan effect. When a person appears on Joe Rogan, they get an instant bump in their numbers, right?
Yeah.
Did you find that to be your experience?
Well, I was on Joe Rogan 10 years ago. And so it wasn't then what it is now. Certainly there were tons of listeners, but it's also not necessarily the same shared audience. I had, certainly for a while, I would have a couple people come up to me at shows and be like, oh yeah, I heard you on Rogan and that's why I became a fan, etc. But any podcast I've done, any big one, like I was on Corolla a couple times, I was on Bert Kreischer's podcast, and there's always like that little bit of bump of people who are interested, and then you kind of weed out the people who actually like you, instead of the people who are just going, oh, someone I like talked to you and therefore I'm your fan now. They're not actually your fan, they're interested. It opens a door, but it doesn't get anybody to walk in. And that's the reason I don't do many podcasts anymore. I did Dr. Drew's podcast last year, and on it I talked to him about the idea that the reason I was doing it was because when I was much younger, he helped me with some medical advice that helped change my life. And so I made time for his podcast. But I don't need a bunch of people who are trying to get their opinions given to them. I thought that the typical podcast listener would be someone who thirsts for knowledge. And there are some podcasts like that, absolutely. But some podcasts, their audience are people who want their opinion that they already have validated, or they want their opinion told to them. It's not that they want to hear someone else's and then think it through and add to it and analyze. And so because of that, like, yeah, I'll do a podcast occasionally, but it's just not something I find to be necessary. I'd rather put my time into talking to people who want to hear what I have to say.
The whole world wants to know the answer to this.
Okay.
When will you finally bless us in the world, now that you have all of these production companies and things for you, when will we finally get a Steve Hofstetter, Brett Druck, buddy comedy movie?
I would absolutely love to do a movie with Brett. That would be so fun. But you know, I've been getting into movies a little bit lately. I got to do one for Lifetime, which was fun, and I guess as that stuff gets bigger, I'll get more of a say in terms of what the genre is and who's in it and things like that. But that would be super fun, because that's basically what it is for us to tour together. So I guess if people really want to see a movie about us just doing annoying bits in a car, well, we have that going on already. We'll just turn the camera on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Steve.
Absolutely.
And have a great show tonight. And we hope you enjoyed your time here in Canada.
Thank you so much.
I'm a bad one.